अस्सलामुअलैकुम रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू। दोस्तों, एक और मेरे चैनल की सबसे बेहतरीन वीडियो में आप सबको खुशामदीद। और ये एक वीडियो है जिसमें एक ब्रिटिश जर्नलिस्ट योन रेडले ने इंकशाफात किए कि बरतानिया और अमेरिका किस तरह एक मुल्क को तबाह बर्बाद करने के लिए साजिशें बनाते हैं। तो ये हम सब मुसलमानों को, बल्कि इस वीडियो ने करोड़ों गैर मुस्लिम और अंग्रेज़ लोगों की भी जो है वो जहन खोल दिया है और बहुत ही बेहतरीन वीडियो है। एक मुकम्मल इन्होंने कुछ एक तकरीर की है जिसमें बहुत ही ख़तरनाक और बेहतरीन इंकशाफात किए हैं। और पहली बार मैंने किसी अंग्रेज़ औरत को देखा है जो इतनी बहादुरी से और इतनी हकीकत और सच बातें कर रही है। तो इस वीडियो को एंड तक लाजमी देखिएगा। इंशाल्लाह ये बहुत ही ज़्यादा फ़नी और हक़ाइक़ पर मबनी और एक इमोशनल और एक इंतहाई अफसुर्दा करने वाली और मालूमाती वीडियो भी है। तो अगर आप ये वीडियो एंड तक देखें, अगर पसंद ना आए तो आपने इस वीडियो को डिसलाइक करके मुझे कमेंट में ज़रूर बताना है, लेकिन इस वीडियो को आपने आखिर तक ज़रूर देखना है।
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Brothers, sisters, friends, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome. It gives me tremendous pleasure to be in New Zealand and to share my story with so many of you tonight. Now I can see a lot of non-Muslims in the room. Just relax. I'm not Islam's answer to Billy Graham. I want to share the story with you so you can enjoy it, maybe understand a little bit more about Islam. The title of the story is From Kabul to Kaaba, but I want to take you back a few weeks before I entered Kabul. I want to take you back to September 11. I bet everyone in this room can remember exactly where they were, who they were with, what they were doing when they heard about September 11. The Muslims that I have spoken to who saw the horrific events unfold on television told me that at the moment of the second plane going into the Twin Towers and realizing it was a terrorist strike, their first reaction was, please God, don't let this be the work of Muslims. I was in my newsroom in Fleet Street in London when I noticed people gathering around the television sets that were there. And I shouted over to somebody at the Sunday Express and said, what's going on? And they said, oh, there's been a terrible accident. There's a plane crashed into one of the Twin Towers in New York. And there's something compelling, isn't there, about live news breaking and live pictures. And I went up and joined everybody else and watched the drama unfold. And then we saw the second plane going in. I've told you about the immediate reaction of Muslims. My immediate reaction was, this is a big, big story. It's bigger than the assassination of JFK, could even be bigger than man landing on the moon. I've got to get out to New York. My reaction was different to those of the Muslims, certainly. By the time I got to Heathrow Airport, the Twin Towers had imploded, the Pentagon had been hit, a plane had gone down in Pennsylvania. America was at war, it was under siege. Her airspace had been closed down, her borders had been sealed, and I physically couldn't get into the country. No matter which airline or which route I looked at, it was impossible. And so I hung round Heathrow in and out for the next 4 days. Finally, I got that ticket for the first flight out to New York. And as I was making my way to the departure lounge, my phone went, and it was my boss, the news editor. He said, there's been a change of plans. We want you to go to Pakistan. I was furious. The contacts that I had been making were in New York. My clothes that I had packed were for New York. I'd never been to Pakistan. I probably needed injections. You know, what is this country? Why do you want to send me there? This is a Middle Eastern thing. Why don't I go to the Middle East? And he said, no, the story is going to unfold in Pakistan and neighboring Afghanistan. Within 12 hours, I arrived in Islamabad, dressed for New York, which went down very well, as you can imagine. And over the next few days, I started writing about people's hopes and fears for the impending war which was going to happen in neighboring Afghanistan, where the richest country in the world was going to bomb the poorest country in the world. By the end of the week, 3,000 journalists from around the world had joined me. They were in Peshawar, they were in Islamabad, and they were down in Quetta. Thousands of journalists from all over the world, from print, radio, TV, the internet, every form of communication you can imagine. I worked for a Sunday newspaper. I was the chief reporter of the Sunday Express, and I was trying to second guess what the news would be at the weekend. You get a chance to be more analytical. And I'm not a journalist who has ever been spoon-fed from governments. I don't trust them. And so I began to think that the best story was probably in Afghanistan. From the ordinary people, the ordinary Afghan people, I wanted to know what their expectations and fears were, what life was like for them living under the Taliban. We'd read a lot of news. According to Bush and Blair, the Taliban was the most evil, brutal regime in the world. They subjugated and oppressed women. They killed them randomly. The tales that were coming out were terrible. I distinctly remember Tony Blair saying, these people are so evil, they won't even let their children fly kites. And so I decided, well, I need to find this out for myself. And I went to the Taliban embassy in Islamabad, and I tried 3 times to get a visa, and 3 times I was rejected. And so in the end, with my guides, I had got 2 or 3 guides who were helping me, I decided to sneak into Afghanistan. The idea was planted in my head by the BBC's chief correspondent, John Simpson, who had put on a burqa and put his toe into Afghanistan and said, hey, look, I've become invisible. And I thought, well, if the BBC's gargantuan correspondent can become invisible, then surely it will be easy for me. And so we devised a plan that we would be part of a wedding party. I would go in with 2 guides, one from the NWFP province in Pakistan, the other one was born in Afghanistan. And we went in as a group. I put on the burqa, we drove through the Khyber Pass. That was another eye-opening experience. I imagined the Khyber Pass to be about 30 yards long. It was 33 miles long, winding, dramatic, mountainous roads, amazing scenery, traces of British imperialism everywhere. And then we went right down into a dust bowl known as Torkham, and there was no man's land. We got out of the car and started to walk towards the Taliban checkpoint, where some very scary-looking men with great big beards and big black turbans and Kalashnikovs were sitting, waiting. Suddenly I could hear my heart thump, thump, thump in my ears, and I'm beginning to think maybe this isn't such a good idea. I wanted to turn round and run away, but I'd gone beyond the point of no return. But it was as predicted. I had become invisible. I didn't even warrant a first look, never mind a second look, as we crossed the Taliban checkpoint. I think I was a cross on someone's ID papers. And we went across, we jumped into a taxi, and we headed for the first major city, which was Jalalabad. I was very tense, very excited. I was going to see firsthand what life was like in one of the major cities in Afghanistan, in this male-dominated regime where women were oppressed and subjugated according to Bush and Blair. When we pulled up at the marketplace, I was really surprised, because there, who was doing all the shopping? The men. You can't get Western men into supermarkets or to do the shopping. And there were all these men doing the shopping. I thought, well, this is a good sign. Of course, the reason for that was under the Taliban regime, women were not allowed to talk to strange men. And strange men were any men other than a husband, a father, a brother, or a close male relative. So doing something as simple as buying a bag of sugar was virtually impossible unless you were related to the trader. There were women around. They were all wearing the burqa, and they were in the company of their mahram, or male companion escort. I sat on the edge of the marketplace and watched. And there were lots of Taliban around, and people seemed very excited and very happy. They didn't seem as though they were about to be bombed by the most powerful nation in the world. People seemed relaxed, and I was quite surprised. Our party then went with provisions to a tiny village, not even the size of this hall. And we went into the village, and there was lots of tears and laughter as one of their own had returned, and he brought with him his cousin from the NWFP, his wife, his children. And then they said, well, who's that? Pointing at me. And he told them in Pashto. I didn't understand the language, but I could tell from the reaction that they were not at all happy. Why on earth have you brought a Westerner into our midst at a time of war? That day, the Taliban spiritual leader, Mullah Omar, had just announced that anyone helping a Westerner would be executed. So naturally, they were angry, they were nervous, they were agitated. But within half an hour, the natural exuberance and hospitality and curiosity of the Afghan people overcame the villagers, and they started talking to me. The first was a young girl in her 20s, and I said, what do you think about this impending war? And she said, I am so angry. I should be in a hospital by now, qualified as a doctor, ready to help my people, ready to save lives. People are going to be wounded in this war, and I could help and save them. And I said, so what is your problem? She said, my training was stopped a couple of years ago. The Taliban closed down the training center and sent all the instructors home. And here I am now, back home, rotting away in this village when I should be helping my people. And I felt very sorry for her, and I could feel her frustration. Here was a young, ambitious girl, and her life seemed to have been put in limbo. Just then, her elder brother came in, and he, through the translator, started talking, and he also had been training to be a doctor at the very same medical school. And when it had closed down for financial reasons, he too had been sent home. So it wasn't just the girl who was being affected, her brother was as well. And as we were communicating with the help of the translator, an Afghan lady walked in and she looked at me very carefully and she put her hands on her hips and she really looked me up and down. And then she said through the translator, "Have you any children?" And I said, "Yes, I have a daughter." She said, "Just one?" And I said, "Yes, just one." And she pushed me, very strong. I lost my balance and went the other way. And she said, "You English and American women, you are all so pathetic. All you can ever have is 1 or 2 children. Me, I can have 15. And when you run out of your boy soldiers, I will be producing more." Don't think that Afghan women are shy, retiring creatures. And I thought, well, if this is what the women are like, what on earth are the men like? And I said, "But aren't you afraid of America, of American soldiers?" She said, "Dare one American soldier come into my village and I will get those pots and pans and I will fight him back myself." And I thought she probably would. Then she said, "Look, I'm really sorry about this mishap. We're very sorry, but this mishap in New York, it has nothing to do with us." And she kept calling 9/11 a mishap. And I thought, you know, this is really provocative, this is so offensive, this is insulting. 6,000 plus people have died, that's what we thought at the time, and you're calling it a mishap? And then I realized that under the Taliban, televisions were banned. Nobody saw the dramatic images that we saw, which were played on our TVs every day, day in, day out, for more than 2-3 weeks, whipping up the anger and the hysteria and the fear, watching the towers being hit, the towers imploding. They didn't see any of that. They lived in single-story buildings. So trying to convey to them the full horror of someone trying to jump from the 101st floor rather than face the inferno inside was very, very difficult. And that is why the Afghan people referred to 9/11 as a mishap. But she said, "We're very sad. But what has this got to do with us? Why do the Americans want to bomb us? We didn't do that." And her argument had some logic to it. As the afternoon progressed, I could tell that people were getting more and more nervous by my presence in the village, and we took some photographs after some persuasion, and then we left. We thought we'll head back early. But by the time we got back to Torkham, the gates had closed, these great big metal gates, and we couldn't get through. Apparently Pakistan had sealed the border. They weren't letting anybody in or out. We stayed overnight, and the next morning we went back to the area of Torkham, and again the gates were closed. And I said to my guides, if I don't get back by a certain time, my news editor will raise the alarm and there will be all sorts of panic. And one of the guides said, well, we can go through a smuggling route. And my eyes lit up at this. I thought, this is very exciting. This will give me something to write about and add to the humanitarian report that I will be doing. And I said, great, okay. And I imagined that we'd be going through narrow mountain passes and ducking from bush to bush, and it would be really exciting because the border with Afghanistan is about 1,400 kilometers long, and there are said to be about 300, 400 smuggling routes. So you can imagine how porous the border is. And so we went to this area called Dawah Baba. But there was nothing secretive about it. In fact, there was probably more people in Dawah Baba than there are in this room tonight. There were camel traders, there were donkey traders, there were people selling refreshments, people selling carpets. There were Afghan families with all their goods packed into hand carts heading towards Pakistan, unable to bear facing yet another war in their country, wanting to get to the safety of Pakistan. And there were lots of young men striding over from Pakistan, looking for Taliban recruiting officers because they wanted to sign up and fight with the Taliban against the Great Satan, as they referred to America. By this time, the Afghan shoes I had been wearing were cutting into my feet and they were bleeding and sore. And I complained, and one of my guides said, well, we're only 10 minutes away from the border, but we can go by donkey. And he said, can you ride a donkey? And I thought, can I ride a donkey? You know, I can ride a horse, I can jump with a horse. Look at these donkeys, they're smaller. They're the same shape and size, same shape, you know, and they look more or less the same, but they're smaller, probably easier to control. Of course I can ride a donkey. And so we set off and did a deal with this man. I never understood how we were hiring it, how he was going to get it back, but he was happy to part with the donkey. And I got on its back. Now, I don't know if it sensed that it had an infidel on its back or what, but it just bolted. And it tore through this area. And my feet were waving, my arms were waving. The wind caught the burqa that I was wearing and billowed the burqa, which made the creature even more frightened, and it ran even faster. I was screaming, my arms like this. I must have looked like a giant bat trying to balance on this wretched beast which was out of control. And as I moved forward to try and get hold of the reins just to stop it, the one piece of equipment that I had taken with me, a camera banned under the Taliban, slipped out of the folds of my burqa right into the passing view of a Taliban soldier. He saw this and went crazy. Now, I don't know whether the donkey stopped and threw me off, whether he stopped the donkey and pulled me off. What happened, I really can't remember. All I remember is hitting the ground at a great rate of speed and then picking myself up. And as I drew myself up, I looked straight into the face of this Taliban soldier through the grill of my burqa. And he was screaming and shouting at me. When I got back to London, some of my girlfriends said, what was going through your mind at that precise moment when you knew the game was up? And I said, well, for a nanosecond, and I said it was a nanosecond, I looked at this Taliban soldier and I thought, my goodness, you're gorgeous. He had the most amazing green emerald eyes, very high cheekbones and a great big beard with a life of its own. Very, very striking. But as I say, it was a nanosecond. And then I thought, oh, I've been caught. So I took my camera off and I handed it to him, and then I closed my eyes, waiting to be shot in the head. And when I opened my eyes after a few seconds, he'd gone. He'd gone over to the man who hired the donkeys. He wanted to know who is in charge of this woman. And then he would get to the bottom of the camera. I was delighted. I thought, I can get away. He still doesn't realize that there's a Westerner under the burqa. And I turned and went to attach myself to another group to follow them over the border. And as I walked away, I looked behind, and by this time a crowd of about 100 men had surrounded my two guides.
تو دوستو ویڈیو آپ لوگوں نے دیکھ لی، یہ فرسٹ پارٹ ہے. اس کے علاوہ اس ویڈیو کا دوسرا اور تیسرا پارٹ، 2 پارٹس اور آنے والے ہیں. ایک بہت ہی لمبی اور بہترین ویڈیو ہے. آگے مزید کہانی اور بہتر ہونے والی ہے. اس کے ساتھ پھر کیا ہوتا ہے، پھر اسے طالبان پکڑ لیتے ہیں، اور ایک بہت ہی بہترین ویڈیو ہے آگے بھی. تو انشاءاللہ سیکنڈ پارٹ میں آپ کو اپلوڈ کر کے بتا دوں گا، اور وہ اگر یہ ویڈیو آپ 2-3 دن بعد دیکھ رہے ہیں تو آپ کو یہ یہاں پر نظر آ بھی رہا ہے. تو یہ اس کا سیکنڈ پارٹ ہے. اس ویڈیو کو کوشش کریں کہ آپ نے مکمل 3 جو اس کے حصے ہیں ان کو مکمل دیکھنا ہے، اور یہ بہت ہی بہترین ویڈیو ہے. اس کے اب تک جتنے بھی ویڈیو آپ لوگوں نے دیکھ لی، اس کے بارے میں آپ کیا سمجھتے ہیں، اور اس طالبان مجاہد کے بارے میں آپ کیا سمجھتے ہیں جب انہوں نے دیکھا کہ واہ یہ مطلب کہ اس کی آنکھیں ایسے. تو اس مکمل ویڈیو کے بارے میں اب بھی باقی رہتی ہے، لیکن اب تک آپ کو کون سی چیز اس میں اچھی لگی کمنٹ میں مجھے ضرور بتائیں. انشاءاللہ اس کے دوسرے اور تیسرے پارٹ میں پھر ملتے ہیں. تب تک والسلام.